Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're at home joining our study, we appreciate you sharing in our study of the book of 1 Corinthians. We've been studying this book for, I think, actually since like April, it feels like, if I was looking at some things today. But we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 here in just a few moments. And we have kind of spent some time here. We got slowed down a little bit. I know what's coming towards the end of chapter 14 here and the discussions that will occur out of that narrative, and so knowing what's coming towards the end of chapter 14, I would imagine that we probably will be lucky to finish chapter 14 tonight, but we'll see how that goes once we get to those segments. But before we get any further in the study, if you would bow your heads with me, let's go to God in prayer together tonight. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this opportunity to be together and to study from your word, to appreciate the testimony of the gospel and the message that Paul delivered to Corinth. We pray for wisdom as we strive to understand and to apply the things that you have shared with us within the pages of the Bible. Strengthen us in all that's good and right, to give us the courage to live as your children. And we pray all these things through Christ's name. Amen. So, throughout really the letter as a whole, Paul's been doing several various things. And in more recent conversations within the letter, he's been talking about the idea that there are some things that need to take precedent in their minds. In chapter 13, he kind of said, you need to quit being so focused on spiritual gifts to the point that you're neglecting what? Love. So that was the kind of the first warning, if you will, as it relates to that. He comes then in chapter 14 and says, if you're going to desire spiritual gifts, which one should you desire? Yeah, so you want to do prophecy in particular, but for the reason for that was because if you can do that, if you can deliver the message of God, you can encourage the church, you can help those who are outside the church who may come into your assemblies, you can benefit more people with that spiritual gift than and particularly contrast that to what? The use of tongues, right? And particularly unknown tongues, meaning you could speak some language that nobody in the audience could understand. And that shouldn't be used at all unless there's what? An interpreter. Somebody there that could explain it. Somebody there that could define what was being said. And so we've been through this discourse and discussed the various aspects of the things that are happening in this particular chapter. And we'll pick up, if you bounce down, we're going to pick up relatively later in the chapter, as we've already discussed these various points. But let's just pick up in verse 18. That'll help us set the context of where we're moving forward to. Paul mentions the fact that he had the ability to do what? Yeah, speak with tongues more than all. Yeah, but so don't glory in it, Paul says. If you wanted to compare, Paul says, I could do that. But he says, I'd rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that by my voice I might teach others also, than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. I'd rather say 5 words that people could clearly understand and make sense out of and use than to spend my time saying 10,000 words that nobody got. And we talked about that last week in our study. He pointed in verse 22 that tongues were for a sign, not to them that believe, but to them that believe not. But prophesying serveth not for them that believe not, but for them which believe. If therefore the whole church be come together into one place, and all speak with tongues, and there come in those that are unlearned or unbelievers, will they not say that you are mad? And so there needs to be some concern as to what the impressions you may give. If somebody was to come into your assembly and everybody speaking in these unknown tongues, what are they going to think? These people are crazy. I don't understand any of this. And nobody's explaining what's going on. There's nobody to interpret. And it just seems chaotic. I think that's an important thought for us to get into our minds before we move forward in chapter 14. The context of chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians is a result of chaotic assemblies in Corinth. And the manner in which the Apostle Paul deems it necessary to address those chaotic moments in the assemblies at Corinth and how it is they might be able to handle that situation. If we don't grasp that point of what Paul's actually discussing, we may overreach this particular chapter. I'm going to point to some other chapters that help us in other ways, but this particular chapter we can overreach if we don't actually look at what Paul's addressing and dealing with, and you'll see what I mean by that here in just a moment. But, verse 24, if all prophesy, and there come in one that believeth not, or one unlearned, he is convinced of all, he is judged of all. And thus are the secrets of his heart made manifest, and so falling down on his face, he will worship God and report that God is in you of a truth. Decency, order, doing things properly, using the message in the right ways, those things are going to encourage somebody that might come into your assemblies to at least understand what's going on and to be able to understand the message that is being delivered. There's a challenge in Corinth with chaos in their assemblies. It's evident by this approach of emphasizing the use of unknown tongues, so much so that they had raised it to a bar that was more important even in their minds than prophecy. So you had chaos in their assemblies and nobody learning anything. So how do I correct that problem? And that's where we're at tonight in our study, verse 26. How do I turn chaos in Corinth into order? How is it that I can turn all this problematic approaches towards worship, which was beyond just this issue, by the way. They already had issues with what when they were coming together? The Lord's Supper, right? We've already dealt with that. Paul already had to address their challenges and problems over the Lord's Supper, and so he's just dealing with more difficulties going on in Corinth with disorderly worship. So how is it then, verse 26, brethren, when you come together, every one of you hath a psalm, hath a doctrine, hath a tongue, hath a revelation, hath an interpretation, let all things be done unto edifying. So, the first problem is there seems to be an approach to worship in Corinth that everybody what? Yeah, everybody does whatever they want. Everybody comes, and so everybody comes and shows up, and they've either got a psalm, they've got an unknown tongue to offer, they've got a prophecy to offer, and so their worship services were probably pretty lengthy. If every single person arriving at the assembly had some act of worship that they wanted to render personally, then you've got this enormously long service. I think that's evident by what he's about to say, by the way, here in a second as well. That doesn't result in what at the end of the verse? Edification. At the end of the day, all they had were individuals exercising their particular skill set or spiritual gift, and they weren't resulting in any real benefit or edification from it. Paul says that's not of any value. If you come together, and in some senses, so what if everybody did their spiritual gift, or everybody sang their song, or if people aren't edified, then it served no real purpose. Let everything be done unto edification. Let everything be done unto edifying. So if any man speak, how do I accomplish that? Verse 27, if any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by what? 2 or at the most 3. What did he just do? Shrink it. Yeah. So number one, let's have some order when it comes to how many of you are going to use your tongue speaking abilities when you arrive. And then that by course, and let one interpret. So it appears, and I think Bill's right, I don't know that Paul says this, but it seems as though they would do what? They'd speak over each other, like I just did. They'd speak over each other. They wouldn't even wait for somebody over here to be done. I suppose maybe because they feared, because everybody was chiming in and jumping in and trying to get their 2 cents, that if they didn't just jump in, they may not what? Yeah, they may not get their turn, right? They may not be heard. And so they're just interrupting one another. And so Paul says, number one, you all don't need to use your tongues every time you show up at the assembly. That's the first thing. First order of business to get your assemblies more organized is let's cut down from this everybody thinking they need a turn, and let's find 2 or at the most 3 to be involved. And then if those 2 or 3 get involved, then don't talk over one another. And once something's been said, let's what? Let's have an interpretation of that. Let's pause and actually let somebody explain what was just said, because we know what the earlier condemnation was. What did he tell them if there's nobody there to interpret it? Yeah, don't say it at all, right? If there's nobody there to interpret, the instruction of the Apostle Paul's already been spoken. Don't speak at all. If there's nobody there that could help others understand what it is you said, then just don't even use that spiritual gift at all in that setting. Now he further dictates to help them have order. Pick 2 or 3, let them be in an orderly fashion, and pause long enough for an interpretation to occur, for somebody to define what was just said by those who are speaking in tongues. And if there be no interpreter, let him keep, what's the word, by the way? Let him keep silence. I believe we're going to see that word 3 times in the narrative before we're done.
What does the word edification actually mean to the church?
To build up, to encourage, to strengthen. All of those are part of edification. Yeah. And Paul's, depending on context of study and thought as it relates to worship, sometimes the Bible speaks of worship from its emphasis, and that is directed towards God, spirit and truth, John chapter 4. Other times, the conversation like Paul was having is about what effect does it have on those who have assembled. So I don't know that he's saying edification is more important than focus on God. I think he's just saying that's their problem. Doesn't appear like their assemblies were very edifying, because all they had was chaos. People talking over one another, tongues being used that nobody could interpret or understand. When they came together, everybody thought that they had a right to have their moment. They had chaotic assemblies.
How do we edify the church today?
Well, sir, I think order would have to be part of our efforts to make edification work as well. They've got some peculiarities that don't exist for us. I mean, they've got issues that we don't have. But our efforts to edify through our worship could learn from them that we appreciate the same kinds of things, and that is that there needs to be order. There needs to be some understanding of limitations as it relates to it, or it becomes less edifying in the process. Go ahead, Bob. I would argue that maybe from a different angle, his need would probably not be there because he could do it himself, and he has the authority of an apostle to speak. They need interpreters because somebody's got to validate what was said. Yes. I think that's part of the chaos. Their particular tongue that they can speak that's not native to them. Correct. Their abilities may be different than what we saw on Pentecost, where every man heard in his native tongue. Their abilities are obviously limited to a particular number of languages, tongues that they can speak in. I would agree if that's the question as I understand it, they are similar. Pentecost and what happened there and what's going on with these folks are similar, but there is a difference, I think, as to what was bestowed upon those apostles on the day of Pentecost and what these folks are experiencing. And even that scene is somewhat different in Acts chapter 2. Yeah. 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 I would argue that there is a definite distinction between what the apostles received from the Spirit directly on Pentecost and what somebody else received by the laying on of the hands of the apostles. Because the apostles seem to be in some senses unlimited, if you will, and anybody that received something by the laying on of the hands of the apostles was limited to a gift, or it had limitations that they didn't experience. Yeah, there seems to be a multitude of folks, and of course Paul didn't necessarily dive into that thought process of how many are legit and how many are, you know what I mean? But there's definitely some chaotic scenes going on there. So if there's no interpreter, let him keep silence in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God. Let the prophets do what? Speak 2 or 3. Okay? Not every prophet that shows up that day needs an audience. He doesn't have to speak just because he can. If you want to keep order, then allow for 2 or 3 to speak, and let the others what? Yeah, make sure it's accurate. Right? Let a prophet or one claiming to be, let them speak, 2 or 3 of them, and then if there's somebody else that has the ability of prophecy, let them help determine the validity of whether that was actually a prophet. Is there a valid teaching happening there? It's a different time, right? We can understand what's valid and not by looking at what? The Scriptures, right? We have a much easier time than they did as it relates to being able to determine what is valid and what isn't as it relates to the message of God, because we have it. We have it in its fullness. They were getting it as it was coming. And so at times a prophet might speak, and then he would need to pause and allow for somebody else to validate and give some corroboration, if you will, to whether what he just said was true or not. And so to create order within their worship services, when these spiritual miraculous gifts were accessible to them, when it came to tongues, use 2 or 3, let somebody interpret every time, and if you don't have an interpreter there, then be silent. When your prophets speak, pick 2 or 3, let them speak, and each time one of them says something, let the others who have the ability to be prophets in that spiritual gift, let them validate or judge what's being said. If anything be revealed to another that sitteth by, let the what? Let first hold his peace. So it shouldn't be a dogfight over who has the floor. The man who's speaking, if the one who's judging that prophecy has something additional to add or some clarification to add, then the first man should simply pause and give audience to the other to allow them to speak and to clarify maybe some point that had been revealed. And so again, they're dealing with things that you and I don't deal with today. But again, the concept is still there of how you can be decent and in order, which is the very last phrase of the chapter, and how you maintain that even in the days of spiritual gifts, and in some senses a more simpler thing for us to do. So the different prophet, that one he gets a thought, pause, allow for decency and order in that process. For ye may all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be comforted. And so if you keep order, people will learn, they'll be educated, they'll be edified, genuine benefit comes. When was the last time you actually left a shouting match and anybody understood anything? Right? You've seen two people argue and they're just shouting over one another, and nobody leaves that scene knowing anything better. A little discipline will help. The benefit would be if somebody walked in and an unlearned walked in and they were from some other country, some other land that spoke a different language, this being a city that had reason for foreigners to come, strangers to come in and amongst Corinth, and a guy walks in and he doesn't speak your language and you've got the ability to speak his language, now I can speak because he can understand what I'm saying. Otherwise, hold my tongue. I mean, that's my simple answer to your question, would be they have the ability for when it has use and purpose. When somebody would come into their assembly or into their presence otherwise that spoke a different language. And keep in mind, that tongue speaking, number one, it's languages. And number two, it's about the ability to speak a language that you didn't naturally learn. You weren't raised in that culture. You were able to speak a language. It'd be like me waking up tomorrow morning and being able to speak French. I can't speak it now, but I woke up tomorrow morning and now I can speak. And so now if somebody ever came into my presence that spoke that language, I'd be able to communicate to them. I believe that's what these folks' abilities were about. Not what the prophets received, and not what the apostles received at Pentecost. This is more limited. And it's limited by how many they can speak. Because Paul said, I can speak more than all of you. And so it's limited on how many they can speak, and it's limited on how it's used because of that limitation. It can only be used for edification and real benefit when somebody in their presence can actually either speak it or somebody can interpret it. And so they could use it in that setting, according to Paul, as long as there was somebody there that could interpret what they said to the rest of the group. So there, and if that helps, I do believe there's a distinction between what happened with the apostles at Pentecost and what these folks had. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Two similar but not exact in what's happening with these folks and what happened with the apostles. Absolutely. Yeah. All of these situations, in some senses, had a very specific purpose for a time period. Yeah, at the same time. Verse 32 adds an interesting point, I believe, that we need to at least catch. He said, and the spirits of the prophets. I want to read that, make sure you read it. And the spirits of the prophets. So if I was a prophet, I'm talking about whose spirit? My spirit, my inward man. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. Why do you think he would say that? Okay, keep in mind, what have they been having? People talking over one another, chaos, everybody's got to say what they want to say, and you got all this. And so what might I argue if I'm a prophet and Paul's come along and said, no, listen. You're the sixth guy today. You know, nobody has even stopped to judge these matters, and now you're shouting over this guy. You need to settle down. And I might say, what? Well, I can't control it. I can't control it. What'd Paul say? Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can. These miraculous abilities that had been bestowed upon them were not beyond their abilities to control and maintain. There was no such thing. It's just I'm forced and moved to the point. That wasn't happening among these folks. The abilities they were given were within their abilities to control. I know, in other words, that there's nobody in the audience that speaks this language, and I've got the ability to just stop and be silent. I know there's others speaking right now, and they're edifying the group sufficiently. I don't need to add it's not a forced issue. The prophets are able to they don't vacate their will just because they were given a spiritual miraculous gift. Their will is still intact. Neither the Holy Spirit or God, according to the Apostle Paul, is forcing anyone to any particular moment, requiring and or forcing them to act upon their particular spiritual gift. It's within their control. It's subject to them. What reason is given for that? For God, verse 33, is not the author of confusion. Sometimes we take that verse out of context. The context that verse is stated in is basically with these folks in Corinth who were just completely out of control when it came to the use of their spiritual gifts. Paul defined their assemblies as confusing. It was confusing to those who were members there because they didn't understand half of what was being said. There was no order or decency to it. It was confusing to the unlearned or somebody who didn't know. When they would come in, they didn't know what was going on. Everybody's using all these different languages and nobody can interpret. It's just a mess. And God says through Paul, I'm not an author of confusion. And the way you're giving people the impression, you're confusing them. And so don't think for a moment that you can't be silent when it's time to be silent. Don't think that you can't limit yourself in some way. For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace. And here's significant, as in where? All churches. Now, Paul's going to say something about this later in the text. I want to introduce it to you here, and then we'll see it later when he actually says it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, when Paul dealt with that series of head coverings or no head coverings and that whole thing, he made the comment that the churches have no such custom. There seems to be this repeated theme within this letter to those in Corinth where they appear to have set themselves up as kind of above everybody else in the way the churches that were established through the Apostle Paul into Jesus were behaving and conducting themselves. They were acting as though they were the anomaly to everybody, or that they were superior to everybody. Paul says, where did you come up with this idea that we don't have to maintain the customs as it relates to head coverings? I don't know that that's going on in any other churches, he said. Well, now here in chapter 14, he's done the same thing. Well, how did you draw this conclusion that your disorderly worship is the way to go? Because none of the other churches are behaving that way. It's not what you see among the churches that I've established in any other place. So what led you to draw the conclusion? He's going to actually say that here in a minute. But what led you to draw that kind of conclusion? Now, here's where it gets interesting, right? He doesn't break thought. He just continues in verse 34 by saying, let your women keep what? Same word, by the way. If you can't interpret, be quiet. Right? Same concept here. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also what? What law? Yeah, Old Testament law. Where'd they get their customs from that he spoke about in chapter 11? Old Testament law and the culture they were living in. So, Paul says, 1 Corinthians 11, why cause problems when the accepted custom of the day is that women praying and prophesying should have their heads covered? Why have you determined that that's something that you ought to resist and create challenge and disagreement and fussing? What led you to draw that? That's basically what he says at the end of chapter 11. Same thing here in chapter 14. You've got this situation where you're trying to create an order to your worship. And he just got done saying, by the way, if you've got somebody that's prophesying, then what should happen behind that? Someone should interpret or judge it. Somebody should judge it, and that judgment, people need to pause and listen to whatever might be being questioned or raised. On the heels of that, let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. Now, sometimes we run 100 miles to try to, I don't know, validate or fix, and we don't have to run that far. Sometimes we'll say, well, he can't be talking about utter silence, meaning no sound whatsoever, because she is equally commended to sing, and she's got to speak in it, right? And so we run over here to try to show what 1 Corinthians 14 isn't. Why don't we just stay where it is and try to figure out what it is? Rather than, sometimes I think we work so hard at trying to figure out what 1 Corinthians 14 isn't that we neglect to actually figure out what it is. What's he actually talking about here? And so, let them keep silence in church, for it is not permitted them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law, and, connector, by the way, and if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. Now, what's the natural question that comes up from that? What if they what? What if they don't have a husband? And once again, we're back to trying to figure out what it isn't, rather than figuring out what it is. Now, I saved myself a whopping 6 minutes. We do have a challenge that doesn't always get discussed when you come into 1 Corinthians 14. Because our natural inclination simply look at 1 Corinthians 14 and say what? Women can't? They can't speak. And in particularly, what do we mean by that? They can't teach, they can't preach, they can't lead us. That's the conclusion we draw. Let's see whether the text actually preaches that and teaches that or not. So here's the question I have for you. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11, if they were going to pray or prophesy, they needed to what? Had their head covered. He didn't say anything about being quiet. He didn't say be silent in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, did he? He said if they're going to pray or prophesy, put a covering on. But now in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, he says be silent. Which is it? That's what I'm asking. Okay, now, but I want to, and you're right. You're right. 1 Timothy 2, we can go there, and we will before we're done. But I want to understand, they didn't have 1 Timothy 2. 1 Timothy 2 was written about 11 years later. And so what were they going to conclude when they saw this portion of the letter, when he just got done telling them in chapter 11, if they're going to pray or prophesy, put a covering on. Now in chapter 14, he says, be silent. Which is it? I'm not answering questions tonight, by the way, on this. I'm only asking them. No, go ahead. They were in chapter 11, at least that was the conclusion we made. And that continues to be the discussion in chapter 14. It's about spiritual gifts in chapter 14, just like it was in chapter 11. Conversation's the same. And my point would be, and I'll answer your question with a question. If the argument then is, and I'm not saying you're saying this, is what I'm thinking from your question. If the argument, 1 Corinthians 14 is dealing with unspiritually gifted women. And 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is dealing with spiritually gifted women. Am I right? If that be the case, then Paul forgot to tell us. Because he doesn't make that distinction. And that would be my answer or my question back. Yeah. And again, that might help us if we're traveling down a road of what it isn't. Does it help us understand what it is? Okay, so let's walk that road for a minute. So the conversation up to that point has been, if somebody prophesies, then somebody needs to judge. And if somebody's going to judge and they have something different than the first one's, to do what? Keep silent. So the first one's got to be silent, while the second one basically raises a question or says, hang on, there's more information. And might it be that that's where her limitation kicks in? In other words, contextually, she can't be the one doing that. That's the thought process going through the process here. If she can't be the one to raise, and now add, if she has a question, she should do what? Ask her husband at home. Keep in mind it's hard because the words woman, husband, wife, they're all the same translated word. We don't always, but here's my point. Is it possible your husband is miraculously, spiritually gifted? He's the one prophesying. And now you're sitting over here as his husband, and you don't agree with something he said, and now in the assembly you've done what? Yeah, you've usurped his authority. You haven't demonstrated submission because you've spoken and judged over him in relationship to what it was that he prophesied concerning. That seems to be the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 14. 30 seconds. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 is a whole different ballgame. If we want to go 1 Timothy chapter 2. If we wanted to go look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, totally different conversation. Paul's not addressing to Timothy the same kinds of situations that are going on here in Corinth. Go look at it. I don't have the time to develop all this. I promise, well, no, I'm not promising you anything. I may just skip past the rest of it by next week. But let me look. Not even let the folks at home stay a little longer today. But look at 1 Timothy chapter 2. So the conversation Verse 9 is that she adorned herself what? Modest apparel, shamefacedness, sobriety, right? But basically, verse 10 is the clincher. But as one becometh one professing godliness. Let the woman learn in silence, same word, with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. So, that text deals more with the authoritative challenge of why isn't she up here where I am? Why isn't she in that? 1 Corinthians 2 deals with that. I'm sorry. 1 Timothy 2. That's right. So, and he even explains that, right? Whether, and culturally it could be frustrating to folks, societally it may sound horrible to say these things. Paul's pretty plain as to why these instructions were given in 1 Timothy chapter 2. It's because she what? Yeah, she sinned first. That's part of it. And she was second in the creative order. And so there's this understanding that God provides that His order is designed based on that. And because of that order, it's important for us to honor and respect that from the collective sense. My point, friends, is simply this. If we're going to talk about whether women should be adult Bible class teachers or preachers or lead singing or those kinds of things, let's have that discussion out of 1 Timothy chapter 2. Because 1 Timothy chapter 2 actually addresses that, about authority and usurping over a man and being over a man. If we mesh 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy chapter 2 to too much degree, we could find ourselves in trouble in a conversation about what's really happening in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. I'm not saying we've done anything wrong in relationship to how we've structured our worship. What I'm saying is, let's pick the right text to have that discussion out of. Let's pick the text that actually addresses it. 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 seems to be about spiritual gifts and who's judging who in relationship to what prophecy was offered, and it's a different kind of scene than what Paul deals with 11 years later in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Say that again. 1 Peter 3. Yeah. Those texts are different kinds of context and different kinds of situations. And if we blur them all together, what happens is we begin to define things, and we can be called into question because we haven't actually tried to understand 1 Corinthians 14. We just lumped it in with 5 or 6 other verses or tried to answer it with other verses rather than just look at it and say, what does it say? And what's actually happening there. And it doesn't change our practice or any kind of authoritative approach towards anything because we have other narratives and texts that address those very issues. And so just some caution is all I'm suggesting. I'll come back to it. I'll not, well, you got a week, stew on it, I guess, but I'll come back and we'll look at it a little bit more specifically before we close out chapter 14. And we will close out chapter 14 whether you like it or not. We'll close out chapter 14. You can shut that off, John. Thank you all for being holy.